The October rain drummed steadily against the windows of my small apartment in Portland's Hawthorne district. I was arranging the last of the orange marigolds in a vase when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Kevin Thompson, my nephew, my late sister's son. "Hi, Kevin," I answered cheerfully. "How are Sarah and the kids?" There was an uncomfortable pause. Kevin cleared his throat. "Aunt Margaret, I need to talk to you about something." I set down the flowers, sensing the shift in his tone. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" "It's about the family reunion trip to Cannon Beach next month. The one we've been planning since summer." My heart began to race. We'd discussed this trip for months. A long weekend at the coast where 3 generations of Thompsons would gather. I'd already requested time off from my job at the community center and bought new hiking boots specifically for the beach walks we'd planned. "Well, the thing is," Kevin's voice grew colder, more formal. "We've decided you're not invited." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, watching the rain blur the world outside. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "You heard me, Margaret. The family discussed it, and we all agreed. You're not welcome on this trip." My mind reeled, trying to process this sudden rejection. "Kevin, I don't understand. What did I do wrong? We've been planning this for months. I even helped Sarah research the rental house." "Look, it's nothing personal," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that, well, there have been some complaints about you always trying to organize everything, always having opinions about how we should do things. Mom mentioned how you corrected her cooking at last year's Thanksgiving, and Sarah thinks you're too involved in our lives." I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Too involved? I was trying to help. When Sarah needed someone to watch the kids during her surgery, who was there? When your mother needed rides to her doctor's appointments after her hip replacement, who drove her every week for 3 months? That's exactly what I'm talking about," Kevin snapped. "You act like we owe you something, like you're some kind of martyr." The accusation stung, because I knew there might be a grain of truth in it. After my sister Linda died 5 years ago, I had thrown myself into being there for her family. Maybe I had overstepped. Maybe I had been too eager to fill the void she'd left behind. "Kevin, I never meant to make anyone feel that way. I love you all. You're my family." "Well, maybe you need to find your own life instead of trying to manage ours." His words were sharp, final. "The decision's been made, Margaret. We're leaving next Friday, and you're not coming with us." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion against my windows, matching the rhythm of my breaking heart. I sank into my worn armchair, the one Linda and I had picked out together at a thrift store years ago when we were both young and broke. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, quieter, more lonely than it had in months. The marigolds I'd arranged so carefully seemed to mock me with their brightness. For the next hour, I sat in that chair, cycling through emotions like a broken carousel. Hurt gave way to anger, anger to self-doubt, back to hurt. I replayed every interaction I'd had with Kevin's family over the past year, searching for clues I might have missed, signs that they were growing tired of me. Had I really been that overbearing? When Sarah mentioned she was stressed about planning her daughter's birthday party, I'd offered to help with decorations. When Kevin complained about his lawn looking terrible, I'd suggested a landscaping service I'd heard good things about. When their youngest broke his arm, I'd brought over homemade soup and offered to help with carpools. But as I sat there in the growing darkness of that rainy Portland evening, I began to see how my helpfulness might have felt like judgment to them, how my suggestions might have sounded like criticism, how my presence, which I'd meant as support, might have felt like surveillance. The realization didn't make the rejection hurt any less, but it helped me understand it. And understanding, I'd learned from my years working with troubled teens at the community center, was the first step toward healing. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts. There had to be someone I could talk to about this, someone who would understand. But as I looked at the names, most of whom were family members or family friends who would undoubtedly side with Kevin, I realized how small my world had become since Linda's death. I'd spent 5 years being the dutiful aunt, the helpful sister-in-law, the reliable family member, but I'd forgotten to be Margaret Thompson, individual person with her own dreams and desires. I'd forgotten to cultivate friendships outside the family circle, to pursue interests that weren't somehow related to taking care of everyone else. The rain began to slow, and I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would take the day off work. I would figure out what Margaret Thompson wanted to do with her unexpected free weekend in November. And maybe, just maybe, I would discover that being excluded from one vacation could lead to something better than I'd ever imagined. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Discovery. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, one of those rare October days in Portland when the sun burns through the clouds and makes everything look like it's been washed clean. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and decided to take a long walk through my neighborhood to clear my head. I found myself at Laurelhurst Park, watching early morning joggers and dog walkers go about their routines. There was something comforting about the normalcy of it all, the way life continued regardless of personal dramas. I was sitting on a bench near the pond when I overheard a conversation that would change everything. "I just don't know what we're going to do, Helen," a woman with silver hair was saying to her companion as they walked past. 26 people signed up for the singles retreat, and now the organizer has food poisoning. The whole weekend is going to be a disaster. "Can't you find someone else to coordinate it?" "Dorothy?" Helen replied. "It's this weekend, right? At the coast?" "Next weekend, actually. Cannon Beach. And yes, I've been calling around, but everyone who has experience with this kind of thing is either busy or already going on the retreat as a participant." I found myself standing up before I'd fully thought through what I was doing. "Excuse me," I said, approaching the two women. I couldn't help overhearing. "Are you talking about a retreat that needs an organizer?" Dorothy turned to me with curious but hopeful eyes. She was probably in her late 60s, with kind eyes and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. "Yes, dear. I coordinate activities for the Portland Singles Network. It's a group for people over 40 who are, well, single. We planned this weekend retreat to Cannon Beach, but our organizer came down with a terrible case of food poisoning yesterday." "I'm Margaret Thompson," I said, extending my hand. And I might be able to help." Over the next 20 minutes, Dorothy and Helen explained the situation. The Portland Singles Network was a group of divorced, widowed, and never-married adults who organized various activities throughout the year: hiking trips, museum visits, book clubs, and occasional weekend retreats. This particular retreat was scheduled for the same weekend my family was planning their trip, and it was designed to be a relaxing, social weekend with optional group activities and plenty of free time. "The thing is," Dorothy explained, "we need someone who can coordinate meals, organize the optional activities, handle any problems that come up, and generally make sure everyone feels included and has a good time. It's a lot of responsibility." I thought about my years working at the community center, organizing programs for teenagers, managing volunteers, coordinating events. I thought about all the family gatherings I'd helped plan, all the logistics I'd managed, skills I'd been told were too much. In one context might be exactly what was needed in another. "I have experience organizing group activities," I said. "I work at the Hawthorne Community Center, and I've coordinated everything from teen camping trips to senior citizen day outings. But I have to be honest, I'm not technically single. I'm widowed." "Oh, honey," Helen said gently. "Widowed absolutely counts as single in our book. When did you lose your husband?" 7 years ago, I replied, and realized it was the first time I'd mentioned David to strangers in months. After Linda died, grief for my husband had somehow taken a back seat to being there for everyone else. He had a heart attack. We'd been married 15 years. Dorothy and Helen exchanged glances. "Would you be interested in joining the group even if you weren't organizing the retreat?" Dorothy asked. "We have members ranging from their early 40s to their 70s, all different backgrounds and interests." I considered this. When was the last time I'd done something purely for myself, something that wasn't about supporting or helping family members? When was the last time I'd met new people who didn't know me as Linda's sister or Kevin's aunt? "I think I'd like that," I said slowly. "But about this weekend, when would you need to know if I can help organize it?" "Honestly, today would be ideal," Dorothy admitted. "We have people driving down from Seattle, flying in from San Francisco. Everyone's already arranged time off work, made their travel plans. If we cancel now, it's not just disappointing, it's a logistical nightmare for everyone." I thought about my own canceled plans, about the time off I'd already requested, about the hiking boots sitting unused in my closet. I thought about Kevin's words, "Maybe you need to find your own life," and realized that maybe this was exactly what finding my own life looked like. "What would I need to do?" I asked. Dorothy pulled out a worn folder from her purse. "We've rented a large house in Cannon Beach. It sleeps 28, so there's plenty of room. The basic meal plan is already arranged with a local catering company. The optional activities are mostly things like group beach walks, a wine tasting, maybe some games, or a bonfire if weather permits. Really, it's more about making sure everyone feels welcome and having a backup plan if it rains the whole time." "Which it might," Helen added with a laugh. This is the Oregon coast in November, after all. I looked at these two women who'd been strangers 5 minutes ago and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the unknown. Here was an opportunity to step into a completely different version of myself, to be helpful not out of obligation or family duty, but by choice, for people who would appreciate it rather than resent it. I'll do it, I said before I could second-guess myself. But I should probably meet the group before we all head to the coast together. Shouldn't I? Dorothy beamed. Actually, we're having an impromptu meeting tonight at Helen's house. Nothing formal, just coffee and dessert so people can meet you and you can get a feel for the group. Would 7 o'clock work? As I walked home that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in months. I had a purpose that was entirely my own, plans that didn't revolve around what other people expected of me. I was going to spend a weekend at the coast with 25 strangers who might become friends, doing something that mattered simply because I wanted to do it. That evening, I stood in front of my closet trying to decide what to wear to meet my potential new community. Not too formal, not too casual. Something that said, I'm responsible enough to organize your weekend, but fun enough to enjoy it with you. I finally settled on dark jeans and a soft blue sweater Linda had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. One I'd never worn because Kevin's wife Sarah had made a comment about it being too young for me. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized Sarah was wrong. The sweater looked exactly right. Chapter 3. Finding My Tribe. Helen's house in the Beaumont, Wilshire neighborhood was warm and inviting, with the kind of lived-in comfort that comes from years of hosting gatherings. When I arrived at 7 o'clock, I could hear laughter and conversation flowing from the living room. For a moment, standing on the front porch, I almost lost my nerve. What was I doing? Inserting myself into a group of strangers. But then Dorothy opened the door with a huge smile, and any anxiety I felt began to melt away. Margaret, come in, come in. Everyone's so excited to meet you. The living room held about 15 people, ranging from what looked like early 40s to mid-70s, and the atmosphere was immediately welcoming. There was something different about this group, a kind of energy I hadn't encountered in years. These were people who'd chosen to be here, who'd actively sought out community rather than just accepting whatever family or circumstance had handed them. Everyone, Dorothy called out, this is Margaret Thompson, our weekend retreat coordinator and newest member. The introductions that followed were unlike any I'd experienced in recent memory. Instead of the polite small talk, typical of family gatherings or work functions, people shared real information about themselves. There was James, a recently retired teacher who'd taken up photography and was hoping to get some great coastal shots. Maria, a nurse who'd moved to Portland 2 years ago and was still building her social circle. Robert, a software engineer who'd been divorced for 3 years and was finally ready to start meeting new people. What struck me most was how curious they were about each other, how genuinely interested in the stories people shared. When I mentioned that I worked at a community center, at least 3 people asked follow-up questions about what that involved, what I enjoyed about it, how long I'd been there. So, what made you want to help us out? Asked Janet, a woman about my age with short gray hair and paint-stained fingers. Dorothy said you just volunteered out of the blue. I found myself being more honest than I'd planned. Actually, I was supposed to go to the coast this weekend with my family, but those plans fell through. When I heard you needed help, it seemed like the universe giving me a better option. Family plans falling through can be a blessing sometimes, said Tom, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a graying beard. My ex-wife used to insist on these elaborate family vacations that were more stressful than relaxing. Some of my best trips have been the ones I took after those plans got canceled. Several people nodded in recognition, and I realized I wasn't the only person in the room who'd experienced family disappointment or rejection. But unlike my tendency to internalize and analyze what I'd done wrong, these people seemed to have learned to see such setbacks as opportunities for something better. Helen brought out coffee and an amazing array of desserts, and the conversation naturally broke into smaller groups. I found myself talking with Maria and Janet about hiking trails in the Columbia River Gorge, comparing notes about favorite spots and best times of year to visit. It had been so long since I'd talked about my own interests, my own experiences, rather than focusing on what everyone else needed or wanted. Are you much of a beach person? Maria asked. I grew up in Southern California, so I have very specific expectations about beaches. Oregon beaches are different. I love them, I said, and realized I meant it. There's something about the wildness of the Oregon coast that I find more appealing than those perfect sandy beaches you see in postcards. The storms, the dramatic rocks, the way the weather can change completely in an hour. That's exactly what draws me to coastal photography, James chimed in from a nearby conversation. You never know what you're going to get. The light can be completely different from one minute to the next. As the evening progressed, I learned more about the planned weekend. The house they'd rented was an old Victorian that had been converted into a vacation rental, with shared common areas and private bedrooms. Meals would be communal but flexible. The catering company would deliver ingredients and basic prepared items, and people could contribute as much or as little as they wanted to the actual cooking process. The planned activities were optional and low-key. A group beach walk on Saturday morning, a wine tasting at a local vineyard Saturday afternoon, and a potluck dinner Saturday night. Sunday would be completely unstructured, with people free to explore on their own or organize spontaneous group activities. The whole point, Dorothy explained, is to create space for people to connect naturally, without a lot of forced activities or rigid schedules. We found that works better than trying to pack too much in. By the time I left Helen's house at nearly 10 o'clock, I felt more energized than I had in months. These people weren't just looking for someone to organize their weekend. They were welcoming me into their community. Several people had exchanged phone numbers with me, not just for weekend logistics, but for future activities. There's a group of us who do a monthly First Thursday art walk downtown, Janet had mentioned. You should join us next month. I've been wanting to try that new Ethiopian restaurant on Burnside, Maria had said. Want to go together sometime? Walking to my car, I realized that what I'd been missing wasn't just family acceptance. It was genuine friendship with people who chose to spend time with me, who appreciated rather than merely tolerated my personality and interests. The next few days flew by in a blur of preparation. I coordinated with the catering company, confirmed transportation arrangements for people who were carpooling, and created a simple contact sheet so everyone could reach each other during the weekend. It felt good to use my organizational skills for people who actually wanted and appreciated the help. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for myself, not practical items for the house or gifts for family members, but things I wanted for this weekend. A new journal for beach writing, a comfortable rain jacket in a color I actually liked, bright red instead of the practical navy blue I usually chose, and a bottle of good wine to contribute to the Saturday night potluck. The night before we were all scheduled to meet at the designated carpool spot, I got a text from Kevin. Hope you're not sitting around feeling sorry for yourself this weekend. Maybe use the time to think about how you can be less intrusive in the future. A week ago, that message would have sent me into hours of self-doubt and recrimination. But now, packing my bag for a weekend with 25 new friends, I found I could read it with something approaching pity. Kevin and his family were going to spend their weekend managing the same old dynamics, the same familiar tensions and resentments. I was going on an adventure. I typed back, "Thanks for the suggestion. I'm actually going to Cannon Beach this weekend too, with some new friends. Hope your trip goes well." I didn't hear back from him, but I didn't expect to. And for the first time since this whole situation started, I realized I didn't really care what he thought about my response. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that makes Oregon autumns magical. I loaded my car with enough supplies to coordinate a small army, backup snacks, first aid kit, games in case of rain, extra phone chargers, and headed to the meeting point in the Lloyd Center parking lot. As I pulled up, I could see several familiar faces from Helen's house already gathered around 2 large SUVs and a van. The energy was infectious. People were laughing, loading bags, consulting maps even though most of them had probably made this drive dozens of times. It reminded me of the anticipation I used to feel before family trips, but without the underlying tension of wondering who would be in a bad mood or what minor crisis would inevitably arise. "Margaret," Dorothy called out, waving me over. Perfect timing. We were just sorting out the final carpool arrangements. I ended up riding with Maria, Janet, and Tom in Maria's SUV, and the 2-hour drive to the coast flew by. The conversation ranged from travel stories to book recommendations to debates about the best coffee shops in Portland. What struck me was how easy it was to be myself in this group. I could share opinions without worrying they'd be taken as criticism, offer suggestions without fear they'd be seen as controlling. When we reached Cannon Beach, the Victorian house exceeded all my expectations. It was painted a soft yellow with white trim, surrounded by weathered cedar fencing and native beach grass. The sound of the ocean was constant but not overwhelming, a rhythmic backdrop that seemed to immediately slow everyone's pace and lower their stress levels. "This is incredible," I said to Dorothy, as we stood in the spacious living room with its large windows facing the ocean. "How did you find this place?" "One of our members owns a vacation rental business. she replied. She gave us the group rate and threw in some extras like the wine for tomorrow's tasting. That's one of the benefits of having such a diverse group. Someone always knows someone who can help with whatever we need. The afternoon was spent settling in, taking walks along the beach in small groups, and preparing for dinner. The catering company had delivered everything as promised, and I found myself working alongside several other people to organize the evening meal. But unlike family gatherings where I often ended up doing most of the work, while others watched TV or socialized, here everyone pitched in naturally. "You know what's wonderful about this?" said Robert, who was chopping vegetables while I organized the salad ingredients. "Nobody's standing around waiting to be served or complaining about what we're having. Everyone just jumps in." That evening, as 26 of us sat around the large dining room table and the adjacent card tables we'd set up, I looked around and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I belonged here. These people weren't tolerating my presence or including me out of obligation. They genuinely enjoyed my company, appreciated my contributions, and made me feel valued just as I was. The conversation flowed from person to person, with everyone sharing stories and asking genuine questions about each other's lives. When James showed us some of the photos he'd taken during his afternoon walk, at least 5 people asked if he'd be willing to give an informal photography workshop the next day. When Janet mentioned she was thinking about starting a painting group, several people immediately expressed interest. "This is what I love about this group," said Helen, raising her wine glass. "We don't just do activities together. We create opportunities for each other to grow and explore new interests." After dinner, some people retired early, while others gathered in the living room for games and continued conversation. I found myself playing Scrabble with Tom, Maria, and a woman named Susan, who turned out to share my love of mystery novels. We talked about favorite authors and swapped book recommendations while strategically placing letters on the board. "You know," Tom said during a particularly competitive round, "it's refreshing to play games with people who actually want to win, but don't get upset when they don't." I knew exactly what he meant. Family game nights had become increasingly tense affairs over the years, with Kevin's kids prone to meltdowns and Sarah making passive-aggressive comments whenever she didn't win. Here, competition was playful rather than personal. Saturday dawned foggy and cool, perfect weather for the planned group beach walk. About 15 of us set out after breakfast, walking north from the house toward Haystack Rock. The conversation was leisurely, people dropping in and out of different groups as we walked, taking photos, collecting interesting shells and stones. I found myself walking alongside Dorothy and a man named Paul, a retired librarian who joined the group 6 months ago after his wife passed away. He was telling us about how difficult it had been to start building a social life after 40 years of marriage. "The hardest part," he said, "was learning to do things just because I wanted to, not because we wanted to." I kept finding myself asking, would Ellen enjoy this? Even when she wasn't there to ask anymore. His words resonated deeply. I realized I'd been doing something similar with Linda, and even with Kevin's family, making choices based on what I thought they'd want or approve of rather than what I actually wanted. "How did you break out of that pattern?" I asked. "Honestly, groups like this. Trying new things with people who didn't have expectations about who I should be or what I should like. It's been liberating." The wine tasting that afternoon was held at a small vineyard just inland from the coast, owned by a couple who'd retired from tech careers in Silicon Valley to pursue winemaking. The setting was casual and educational, with the owners sharing stories about their journey while we sampled their different varieties. I discovered I had opinions about wine that I'd never bothered to develop or express before. I genuinely preferred the drier whites to the sweeter ones, and I found I could taste the differences people talked about when they mentioned notes of various fruits or spices. It was such a small thing, but sitting there expressing preferences about something purely for my own enjoyment felt revolutionary. "You have a good palate for this," said the vineyard owner when I asked a question about their fermentation process. "Have you considered taking a wine appreciation class?" The idea had never occurred to me, but suddenly it sounded appealing, something to explore just for fun, just for my own interest and growth. Saturday evening's potluck dinner was even better than the previous night. People had brought family recipes and local specialties, and the stories that came with each dish were as satisfying as the food itself. My contribution, a salmon dish I'd learned from a cooking class I'd taken years ago, but never made for family gatherings because Kevin's kids didn't like fish, was a hit. "This is incredible," said Janet. "Would you be willing to share the recipe? I've been looking for new ways to prepare salmon." It was such a simple thing, having someone genuinely excited about something I'd made, something I'd chosen to share. but it highlighted how long it had been since I'd received that kind of appreciation for my contributions to family meals. After dinner, some people started a fire in the beach fire pit, while others organized a game of charades in the living room. I moved between groups, realizing I didn't have to choose just one activity or worry about hurt feelings if I wasn't equally attentive to everyone. People were happy to see me when I joined them, and equally happy when I moved on to something else. As the evening wound down, I found myself sitting by the fire with Tom, Susan, and James, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. The conversation had turned philosophical, not in a pretentious way, but in the manner of people who'd reached a stage of life where they were genuinely curious about meaning and purpose. "You know what I've realized this weekend?" I said, surprising myself with the admission. "I think I've spent the last several years trying to be indispensable to people who didn't really want me around, instead of finding people who actually enjoyed my company. That's a hard lesson to learn," Tom said gently. "But maybe the harder lesson is forgiving yourself for trying so hard to be needed." His words hit home in a way I hadn't expected. I had been trying so hard to be needed, to prove my worth through constant helpfulness and availability. But sitting here with these new friends, I realized that belonging didn't have to be earned through service or sacrifice. It could simply exist because people enjoyed who you were as a person. Sunday morning was leisurely and unstructured, exactly as promised. Some people took solo walks, others organized an informal painting session on the beach, and a few of us worked together to prepare a farewell brunch. The atmosphere was relaxed, but tinged with the gentle sadness that comes at the end of good experiences. "I don't want this weekend to end," Maria said as we packed up our belongings. "It's been so restorative." "It doesn't have to end," Dorothy pointed out. "That's the beauty of this group. We'll see each other at the monthly meetings, and there are always smaller gatherings happening between official events." As we prepared to caravan back to Portland, people exchanged contact information and made specific plans. Janet invited several of us to her studio for a painting afternoon the following weekend. James offered to lead a photography walk in the Columbia River Gorge. Susan suggested starting a mystery book club that would meet monthly at different coffee shops around the city. During the drive home, I reflected on how different this weekend had been from my original plans. Instead of spending 3 days managing family dynamics and trying to please people who seemed determined to find fault with me, I'd spent 3 days being genuinely appreciated for who I was. Instead of feeling drained and criticized, I felt energized and valued. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin as we reached the outskirts of Portland. "How was your weekend of finding your own life? Hope you used the time productively." I looked at the message and realized it didn't carry the emotional charge it would have just a week ago. Kevin and his family had spent their weekend at the coast too, presumably having the same old conversations and conflicts they always had. I'd spent mine building new friendships and discovering new aspects of myself. I typed back, "It was wonderful. Thank you for asking. Made 25 new friends and discovered I love wine tasting. Hope your trip was everything you hoped it would be." This time I did get a response. 25 new friends? That seems excessive. I smiled and put my phone away without replying. Kevin would never understand that sometimes excessive was exactly what life needed. Excessive joy, excessive connection, excessive willingness to try new things and meet new people. As Maria dropped me off at my apartment that evening, I realized that this weekend hadn't just been a consolation prize for missing the family trip. It had been exactly what I needed to start building the life Kevin had accused me of not having. A life that was mine by choice rather than circumstance, filled with people who chose to be there rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. Monday morning, I returned to work at the community center with a new perspective on helping others. I was still the same person who enjoyed organizing and supporting people, but now I understood the difference between being helpful and being intrusive, between offering support and trying to control outcomes. More importantly, I'd learned that finding your tribe isn't about blood relations or family obligation. Sometimes the people who truly understand and appreciate you are strangers who become friends over a weekend at the coast, people who see your strengths rather than your flaws, people who welcome your contributions rather than resent them. 3 months later, I received a wedding invitation from Kevin. At the bottom, in Sarah's handwriting, was a note. "We hope you can attend. We've been thinking that maybe we were too harsh before." I RSVP'd that I would be attending a wine appreciation weekend in Walla Walla with my hiking group that weekend, but I wished them all the happiness in the world. And I meant it. I no longer needed their acceptance or approval to know that I was exactly where I belonged, with people who chose to be in my life because they genuinely wanted me there. The family you choose, I'd learned, is often far more meaningful than the family you're born into. And sometimes being rejected from one vacation is the best thing that can happen to you, because it opens up space for adventures you never would have imagined.